This tutorial discusses the contemporary debate in multiculturalism, particularly the critique of multiculturalism that has been launched from different camps and different positions in politics since about the mid-1990s and onwards. And it's a critique that has actually picked up some momentum lately. I'll first start going over some of the initial critique. I'll go over rebuttals to this critique, and then I will end by giving an account of actual policies that have been enacted and implemented in Europe and elsewhere. So first of all, what are these points of critique against multiculturalism? Well, the idea here is that recognizing ethnic groups officially in society leads to several different adverse effects. First of all, it would lead to ghettoization and fragmentation of society, which undermines social cohesion. And this was a point raised by Neil Bisunda, Canadian, who was very early in critiquing multiculturalism. And this probably shouldn't be too surprising, since Canada was the first country to in fact invent and adopt multiculturalism. That critique would rise first in Canada and then come from other places. A second piece here is that ethnic communities would foster radicalism in their midst and essentially use the recognition as a shield to do bad things and get away with it, essentially. That's the gist of this argument. And there have been initiatives to address this: Save Third Country doctrine, racial profiling. These are types of policies that have been suggested to stop this type of radicalism that some people have been concerned with. A third piece here is that giving out group rights and recognizing ethnic groups in this way can lead to oppression of individuals within the group. For example, women can become oppressed in patriarchal ethnic groups, and this is a point raised by the feminist Susan Muller Oken, who is really quite prominent and highly significant feminist scholar. And she gives the example that in some cultures are polygamous, and this is oppressive against women, unlike monogamy. That's her argument. So some rebuttals to this, and this I'm gonna take a bit of extra time for this because these arguments deserve some scrutiny. So let's start with the whole idea of fragmentation in society. Well, first of all, social cohesion is not terribly well defined. What does that really mean? A while back, the British government, in an effort to clearly spell out what British values were and to use those as a foundation for precisely increased social cohesion in society, this government actually turned to the European Human Rights Code. So it went outside of Britain and took a document that was pretty much generally accepted for all of Europe. How those values were particularly British as opposed to European in general, or just pro-democratic or pure pro-human rights in general, was never clearly explained. So anytime any government I should say, has tried to define clearly what makes a particular country unique in cultural outlook, value outlook, in what is the defining trait of British social cohesion as opposed to French social cohesion or German social cohesion. I mean, looking at the concept of nation, there is this sense that this imagined community exists with some form of commonalities between people that we're intuitively aware of. And this is not to suggest that such a bond doesn't exist. What comes to the surface, however, here through this debate on social cohesion is that anytime a government tries to put it into words and make it concrete, it becomes so general that it really doesn't say very much. And this is one of those classic problems. What defines us as a people, as a nation, as a country? it's really difficult to put into law or put into words, governmental policy words. And either it becomes so general it doesn't say very much, or it becomes so focused that really some people in society are excluded that shouldn't be. In other words, ethnic minorities. So this is really a huge conundrum for those who are concerned with social cohesion to define what this is, because that still hasn't been done properly. Another issue here, of course, racial profiling that has been used but has not really been proven to work. Instead, many non-whites have been arbitrarily detained and lost their civil rights, because that's really who gets subjected to these kinds of means. It's people who look like the stereotype of the bad guys we're supposed to be catching. And of course, looks being a really poor indicator for who is going to do what when. So that's how the outcome of these types of measures. Looking back at group rights, I'm going to divide this into two pieces here. First, discussing Muller Oken's argument about multiculturalism being bad for women, and then going into Kymlicka, who has an interesting way of resolving this conundrum. So again, Muller Oken's argument, the rebuttal to her argument that multiculturalism is bad for women is effectively that her argument is based on the point of view of white middle-class women, and it essentializes other culture as inherently patriarchal. And what's really revealing here is her example of monogamy as a more gender equal institution than polygamy. The problem with that example is that monogamy as an institution has nothing to do with gender equality. It was never adopted by society or by the powers that be as a method to create greater gender equality in society. An example of this is that it wasn't terribly long ago, in fact within about a generation in most democratic countries, when it was legally accepted for husbands to rape their wives. Since this was sexual intercourse within wedlock, it was legal. And the fact that the woman did not consent to this had no relevance for the legislators at that point in time. So in fact, monogamy at that point in time was used as a shield for patriarchal practices that really disempowered women in a most profound way. So the conclusion then is that arguing that monogamy is better than polygamy from a gender equality point of view is really ethnocentric. The rebuttal to this is that what Muller Oken was doing was taking for granted that monogamy is more gender equal than polygamy, because she's used to it, having been brought up and socialized into a white middle class society where monogamy is the norm and taken for granted. And this forces us to really think about how our own ethnocentrism conditions our perspective on things like gender equality and so on. Another excellent example of this was the recent turmoil surrounding a Tunisian feminist who protesting patriarchy in Tunisia, simply removed her clothes and took pictures of herself. She had scribbled things across her chest, and then was subjected to some quite intense reactions locally in Tunisia. Effectively, people wanted to institutionalize her for having a mental disorder, and then feminists in the West wanted to rally in support of her. The problem was that when they did so, they started going after Muslim women who had chosen to wear a veil, and were suddenly simply robbing these women of the right to speak for themselves and their own right to choose. And that was an exceptionally poor example of white women trying to save non-white women from themselves, whether they wanted to be saved or not. And this is something that we really have to think about. You know, who has a voice in the debate? Who is speaking for whom, and so on. Kimlicka here has a really interesting solution to the problem of group rights. He divides them between offensive group rights, which is allowing the group a great deal of internal authority, and this type of rights could actually be used to oppress individuals within the group. And the second type is defensive, where individuals within the group are provided with protection from discrimination by mainstream society. And a society that sticks to using defensive group rights could actually solve the conundrum of protecting minorities from mainstream discrimination, while at the same time recognizing the autonomy of individuals in society. Finally, just looking at the policies that have emerged to counter multiculturalism. We have a few examples here. Let's go over them. So in Quebec, there has been the adoption of interculturalism instead of multiculturalism, which was experienced as imposed from the federal Canadian state. And Quebec wanted a made-at-home solution to this. In Europe, many leaders, political leaders, have argued that multiculturalism has failed. This goes for in Germany, in France, and the UK. And they've even argued, some people have even argued that some cultures are not compatible with European values, which harkens back to the idea of sameness. Only people of the kind of same cultures or makeup can get along. Note here that neither Germany nor France ever actually had multiculturalism as a policy framework. Also, the discourse has really shifted. The talk is about moving beyond multiculturalism, and this emphasis on social cohesion and shared citizenship values. But what we see really in practice is that these are used as code words for a return to more sameness. So we're getting back to the idea of one nation that is the same, based on the same ethnic heritage, maybe the same historical heritage, the same cultural markers, and people who don't share in that sameness should not be allowed to be included into this community, which goes right back to ideas about how the nation has been conceptualized as largely homogeneous, which is a very problematic assumption to make. And policies that have been dealing with threats to security or threats to social cohesion include, in France, the expelling of non-French Roma populations, banning of burqas in public spaces. In Italy, this idea of setting up camps for Roma populations. Denmark has really restrained inter-ethnic marriages quite severely, to the point where ethnic Danes are actually moving out of Denmark because they have fallen in love with someone who isn't seen as Danish enough for the Danish state. And in Switzerland, there was the referendum on banning the building of minarets, because they don't belong in a Swiss culture, or not. Again, this idea about sameness. So that's really the trajectory that policies have been taken lately over the past 5 to 10 years. And currently multiculturalism is highly questioned, and policies that are being introduced are focusing more and more on seeing immigrants as suspect, not really trustworthy, and emphasizing sameness. And that's this short tutorial.